Hello there, I'm Senator Stan Kutcher, independent senator from Nova Scotia, and it is my privilege and pleasure to share a few remarks with you as you kick off your Innovations in the Science of Cannabis conference. And my thanks to Dr. McKillop for asking me to make these remarks. You're embarked on a very, very important area of research. And I just want to start by talking a little bit about between science and policy. And there are two complementary constructs that we can think of in that relationship. One is science for policy, and the other is policy for science. I'm going to focus on science for policy. Ideally, policy directions, including legislation, should be informed by best available evidence as they are being developed and then applied. And I want to focus on best available evidence as the touchstone for the use of science. You've all heard of the phrase best practices, which frankly, in my opinion, is a bunch of people sitting around talking about something and saying this is the best way we can do it. We've heard about science-based or science-informed, which frankly, in my opinion, is a good way of saying, well, there was one paper that said X and 27 that said Y, but we're going to do X because it was science-based or science-informed. So we really need to pick up our game here and look at best available science, realizing that in some cases there are gaps in the science, but also acknowledging that the scientific process is not stagnant, and that as new information and better data comes in, we will have better evidence, and that's why we always use the best available evidence. So when we look at the reality, though, sometimes policy comes first without the science being very good. And that can be for political reasons or cultural reasons, social reasons, financial, economic, a whole list of reasons. And it probably doesn't really matter why the policy comes first, but sometimes it does. And that's what happened with the legalization of cannabis in Canada. The policy came first, and the science was not robust enough to give as much direction to the policy as probably many would have liked. When that happens, there will be gaps in the science, but the policy going first allows attention to be brought to the gaps that need to be filled. The other thing is that there is the science of evaluation of the policy. The impact of this policy can be studied over time so that modifications, if necessary, can be made in the policy, looking at the impact of the policy. So science has an opportunity to become reinvigorated after policy occurs, both in going back and finding the information that wasn't fully available at the time of the policy, and secondly, doing the evaluative research that's necessary to see what the impact of the policy would be. So if we look at cannabis, in October of 2018, the Cannabis Act came into place in Canada. And I'm going to quote here, "It's a legal framework for controlling the production, distribution, sale, and possession of cannabis across Canada," end of quote. The purposes are to keep cannabis out of the hands of youth, to keep profits out of the pockets of criminals, and to protect public health and safety by allowing adults access to legal cannabis. So this is an opportunity for a much excellent and needed research into cannabis. For example, research on how did the legislation impact these policy goals? Did the legislation, for example, keep cannabis out of the hands of youth? And if so, for which youth, for how long, and how well? Huge area for research because of the policy. But it also allows us to look at research that we didn't have when the policy came into place. Perhaps the legislation has to be modified. So simply out of my own professional research experience, let me identify two areas that research wasn't available as much as we needed when the policy came into place. So you'll recall that this was a policy for adults, but adults is a nuanced part of the developmental cycle. 16, 18, 20, all called adults, but the brain develops very differently. And cannabis can have a tremendously different impact on whether you're using it at 16 or at 20. So this legislation as a policy framework allows us now to go back and say, we didn't have all this information that we needed before. Maybe we would now need that information. I would argue that we do. Let's do the research into this area to actually determine what impact this policy has on human brain development and human brain outcomes. The other population, from my own personal perspective, is the impact of cannabis on mental illness. We know that there was some research on the relationship with the onset of schizophrenia and cannabis. However, much, much more needs to be known. Can this legislation provide an impetus to do the research that now this legislation is moving in a direction, but we didn't have that evidence before? So I want to thank you very much for the tremendous work that you are all doing. This is such an important area. Here is a policy which has opened up huge doors for research. Do we have enough research funding to do this? I would argue absolutely not. And I have been advocating for doubling the funding to the Tri-Councils so that this research and other research in Canada can move forward expeditiously. Do we have the human resources to do the research? Absolutely not. That's why I've been arguing for doubling the scholarships and fellowships that are available for postgraduate students and for doubling their wages so that they can have an appropriate return for the work that they do. So we are at a point in Canada where we have this policy needing to drive cannabis research, but we need to ensure that it's properly funded and the human resources in our research workforce are available for us now and into the future. So once again, thank you very much for the work that you're doing, and may this conference that you're having inspire you and give you new directions in your endeavors. Thank you very much.